Welcome to the Check 6 podcast. I'm Joe Anselmo, Aviation Week's editor-in-chief. The U.S. Supreme Court's ruling that President Donald Trump's tariffs on imports were illegal rocked Washington and drew a red line on the executive branch's authority. But that's hardly the end of the story. Trump is vowing to reimpose tariffs by other means. And for the aviation industry, which was ultimately exempted from many of Trump's original tariffs, that introduces a new round of uncertainty. Joining me to try to make sense of this are Aviation Week's chief business editor, Michael Bruno, Jens Flottau, who leads our commercial aviation team, and with them is special guest Kevin Michaels, managing director at Aerodynamic Advisory. He advises leading aerospace companies on supply chain issues. Kevin is also the co-author of a newly published book on business aviation. Michael, let's start with you. Are things more uncertain now with this ruling?
Times like this, I think of William Shakespeare, once more unto the breach. Here we are jumping back into that chasm of uncertainty. I come from the camp that thinks that uncertainty is just ramped up again. Maybe not quite as much as we all found ourselves last April during the so-called Liberation Day, when President Trump first announced his tariff regime. But what we were over the past couple of months was a lot more sanguine as an industry. Whether it was investor calls or teleconferences or industry conferences, industry events we would go to, you basically heard executives say, we think we finally got our minds wrapped around the tariff thing. There seemed to have been an agreement that for the most part, aerospace was going to get exempted from trade deals that were getting hammered out. Then, of course, the Supreme Court comes along and rules that President Trump does not have the authority under the law that he was citing for his original regime. And it's worth noting that what the Supreme Court did in their 63 ruling on February 20th is just say that President Trump cannot levy tariffs, otherwise known as taxes, under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, because Congress did not explicitly authorize that, and Congress in the U.S. Constitution is the body responsible for levying taxes. Some of this can get delegated to the president, but Congress has to explicitly authorize them to do that. Now, speaking of which, Congress has, over the many years, authorized the president to levy some taxes in the form of tariffs, specifically under Sections 122, Section 201, Section 232, Section 301, and Section 338. And each one of those have criteria that have to be met. It's more of a hurdle. There's definitely a lot more work, supposedly, that the administration will have to do in order to bring tariffs, and they're limited. For example, Section 122 tariffs, which President Trump announced right after the Supreme Court ruling, allows the president to provide tariffs up to 15% for 150 days due to what's called a payment problem. That's kind of a detail we don't really want to probably get into right now, but basically the president can go slap down tariffs for 150 days up to 15%, and then they could be extended by Congress if Congress so chose. There are these other sections, and maybe we'll get into them in a moment. One of the big ones that I think Aerospace and Defense has been familiar with are tariffs related to Section 232. Section 232 authorizes the president to do investigations, economic investigations, and then levy certain taxes based on the results of those investigations if it's required for national security. And we know that steel and aluminum, for instance, were already announced last year, as were aircraft and parts as investigations. So, long story short, the president's original regime has been struck down, but there are authorities for the president to enact going forward, and President Trump has already announced that he is and will be providing more tariffs based on the previous existing authorities.
Kevin, I was prepping for this podcast and I felt like I was back in a business class in college. It's so complicated. I mean, some of the original tariffs we talked about, the president was threatening Canada because he didn't like an ad that the province of Ontario took out during the World Series. Help us understand what authorities is he using now to impose tariffs after the Supreme Court said his original rationale violated the law.
Yeah, and as Michael alluded to, each of these 4 or 5 tools have different motivations and different processes and decision-making authority, within the government. The 122 that he's talked about, this is one Michael alluded to a minute ago, that the 15% tariff he imposed over the weekend, which is good for 150 days, is due to a balance of payment issue. So he's got to make this argument that it's a balance of payment issue and you need congressional approval after, 150 days. Now, my understanding is that this does not affect the carve-outs for aviation, right? That in the reading of what has come down, my understanding is that this does not mean that 15% gets imposed on aviation for those carve-outs that we previously had under the IEPA exemptions. And Jens and Michael, if you've heard something different, please. It's moving so fast, it's hard to keep track of all this thing.
Right.
So for example, what does this mean? If I'm Vietnam and I was not in those carve-outs from IEPA, I'm an aerospace exporter from Vietnam, my tariffs might be going down, from 30 to 15. If I'm in one of the carve-out countries like the EU, the UK, et cetera, this particular tariff doesn't have an impact on me, but the other ones could. And then 338 is about unfair trading practices. That's a retaliatory tariff. That's from a law in the 30s. That has never been imposed before, ever, is my understanding. So that one is on shaky grounds. But then you get to the more difficult ones, the 232, which I know we'll get into, the steel and aluminum, and then 301, which is really sort of aimed at China only right now, where there seems to be a bipartisan consensus.
Jens Flottau, you are in Germany. You go to Airbus all the time. You were just there last week. What are people in Europe saying about this situation?
Well, what you hear over here is one big silence. No one really wants to talk about it. I was trying to find out what companies think over here about the tariffs, and no one wants to talk about it. A, because they don't want to get in trouble, don't want to expose themselves, and B, because they don't know. There are indications, as Kevin said, that those that have been exempt from tariffs so far will continue to be exempt, but that's not finalized either yet, right? Ironically, there are some, and this is not Europe, but there are some companies and countries which would actually benefit from the new regime. In particular, Embraer. Embraer was still subject to a 10% import tariff to the US so far, which means that anyone who imports Embraer aircraft would have to pay the 10%. Mainly US regional airlines and business aviation operators. So if aviation remains exempt, then that would mean that those 10% would go away, which would be great for US regional airlines. On the other hand, since the first set of tariffs has now been declared illegal by the Supreme Court, another question arises, which is, will airlines like SkyWest try to get reimbursements for tariffs that they may have paid for Embraer 175 deliveries, or business aviation operators for their freighters, business jets? There is, as Michael started this, he mentioned the word uncertainty, and I'm with him. There is huge uncertainty, even more than just a couple of weeks ago. Don't forget the airline side of things. Antonio Neves, the CEO of Etihad Airways, made a comment yesterday, actually, and he spoke about traffic flows and booking patterns. He did see already a change in booking behavior by his customers from certain markets after the latest tariff announcement, because people were uncertain of what that meant to them and to their businesses. It seems to have normalized by now, but that episode just tells me how fragile this all is and how deep the influence of announcements like this is when, even where we don't immediately see it.
Kevin, you were saying that some of these new tariffs the president is going to try to impose might not pass muster, but it took 10 months from when he announced the old tariffs for the Supreme Court to rule them unconstitutional, and he had asked for an expedited ruling. I mean, isn't this a little like whack-a-mole? If the courts say you can't do this, he's just going to try to find another tariff route?
Yeah, it looks like he'll keep trying on this, but I think, I have a slightly more positive spin. So Jens was talking about uncertainty, but this is about getting repaid. We weren't talking about getting repaid for tariffs before. Like, that's a good thing. I don't know when I'm going to get repaid or if I'm going to get repaid is better than my money is gone forever and I'll never see it. So I want to set that context. But I think what's different here is you're getting institutional controls applied to President Trump, that he's not going to be able to go in and be a cowboy and just arbitrarily put tariffs on someone or use it. It'll make it more difficult for him to use it as a diplomatic tool or as a foreign policy or a tool of power, and in his arsenal, the things that he sees. And I do think that is good in the long run. And I'm not a political scientist, nor are any of us, but I would note that we're headed towards a midterm election year. And tariffs are deeply unpopular in America. 75% of voters disapprove of these, and it's imposed an average of $1,000 to $1,500 cost per household, not to be forgotten. So it's going to get more difficult as the year goes on for him to get the backing of his party. He'll do what he wants, but to get the backing of his party. And one final note I'll make too. I was talking to a very large import exporter yesterday, right in the middle of all this, and asked a very basic question, which is, in your experience, who is absorbing the tariffs? And what he was mentioning is that 20 to 35% of the tariffs are absorbed by his clients and the rest is passed on. In other words, the smaller companies have less capability of passing these tariffs on. The big ones are the ones that are in a better position to resist or to request refunds. So as we talk about who's going to get refunds, it might not be that tier 3 machine shop in Wichita that we often talk about on these podcasts.
I just want to chime in. I've got a violent agreement with Kevin on about 95% of what he said. But one thing I think is worth remembering here is that there are 3 different realms, I would say, that President Trump works in. One of which is, of course, the legal realm that the Supreme Court just gave us a ruling on. There's also, of course, the court of public opinion, and that becomes more important as we get closer to the congressional midterm elections. And President Trump has to be very much a politician again. And there's also, finally, the court of negotiation. It's worth remembering that right now there are about 20 framework deals, and Jens alluded to this, between the U.S. and the EU or the U.S. and the UK. But none of these frameworks have actually been worked out. We don't actually know what the details are of them. They haven't been explained. We believe they're still under negotiation. They certainly haven't been vetted or approved by Congress or the public in any way to make sure that these frameworks are actually legal and enforceable and enactable. And that is all yet to come. And so those negotiations right now are almost certainly going to be affected. And Trump is going to do what he does, which we know very well as a negotiator, as a deal maker. He will use bombastic comments on social media to get an effect and then try to get the result or something close to it in the negotiation he's doing. So I come from the camp that says there's a tremendous amount of additional uncertainty that's now headed to the industry, because even though in the end, these frameworks may have some exclusion for aerospace and defense. Trump could say something in the meantime, and it could really disrupt everything. And, there's always a chance that the apple carts just get totally thrown over and these frameworks get thrown out the door simply because somebody said something that the other side didn't like. So to me, uncertainty is increasing and far more than it was 2 months ago. Nobody liked the old IEEPA tariffs, but at least people had an idea of what the world was going to look like.
So aviation is a very big industry. There's aircraft builders, engine builders, supply chain, airlines. Who is the most vulnerable to this? Who should be the most scared?
I think Kevin hit it on the head just a moment ago. It's the lower tier suppliers, and Kevin works with them. So I know he can't name names, but he can definitely tell you about the constant struggles these suppliers are going through. And I will just mention tariffs is one more additional cost that rolls down the hill onto them. These suppliers were still financially vulnerable from the pandemic or from the MAX crisis. They're now being asked to ramp up their capacity to meet the new monthly production rates. Many of them had been extended simply because they ramped up too quickly. They had the audacity to believe Boeing and Airbus 2 years ago when they said they were going to get to, rate 75 on the A320. Kevin, you want to chime in here?
Yeah, it's the 232 tariffs in particular for steel and aluminum. And what this introduces, and by the way, these tariffs are for downstream items. So if it's a steel forging, that forging is subject to a tariff. Now, if a steel forging is imported, you have to work out how much of the value of that forging is foreign steel, right? So what this does is it imposes you need accountants, you need lawyers to try and unpack what the hell the cost structure is, and then how much of this is foreign steel, and there's massive confusion. So it's not just the tariff itself that the small supplier might not be able to pass on. It's the non-value added, it's the overhead that is imposed upon them to figure all of this out. And it gets really, really tricky, like aluminum alloy. Well, okay, a lot of the melt houses are in the U.S. for U.S. supply consumers, but then the pure aluminum comes from Canada, which is where they have cheap hydropower. And so that comes in. So it's like, okay, how much of this aluminum alloy is comprised of aluminum from Canada? And then, and what value? So it really, the accounting of it is a real mess, and it's a lot of additional costs. So it's hitting them two ways at a time with all the other challenges that all of us have, I think, spoken about in the last several years.
And don't forget, in the manufacturing process, a lot of things have changed over the last year. People have rerouted parts to avoid tariffs, which then didn't happen, at least partly. Now, is it changing again this time? Do you have to go back to the old system or partly go back to the old system? It's just another layer of administration and management that you really don't need, particularly in the supply chain where everyone's trying to ramp up. And as you both said, the small suppliers are the ones that are struggling the most.
Well, Jens, speaking of things that didn't happen, the four of us were together last April 3rd. We recorded a podcast when Trump was announcing the tariffs. And I went back and looked at the transcript this morning. I won't say who said this quote, but one of the quotes on this was, "It's like COVID all over again." That didn't prove to be the case, did it? The sky didn't fall. So what's to make us think the sky's going to fall this time on aviation?
Well, the sky didn't fall because, most of the industry was exempt ultimately.
But I would say that we have not seen the other shoe drop, to use a U.S. Analogy here. We haven't seen the end of this yet. We were only 1 year in to the tariffs, and now we're seeing the original set of assumptions change. President Trump is still going to be in office, for 3 more years in his second term. So there's a lot of time for other things to happen.
Yeah. And Joe, something else to keep an eye on is that the USMCA is coming under review later this year, right? And I think it's in July. And this probably doesn't help the odds of a acceptable extension. I mean, it probably makes things a little edgier, and that's something to watch. And so I find it fascinating. If you look at what's happening in Canada now, there have been some recent policy and decisions that have come down, and national defense strategy, and places like Canada now, it's clear it's not just about defense spending like we're seeing in Europe. In Canada, it's been like 1.2% of GDP, really well under the target. But I think there's a growing realization in places like Canada that we need a lot more domestic capability, right? Even if it's less economically efficient to do so, it's happening. So we hear about what's going on in Europe, but within our own NAFTA partners, especially in Canada, it's definitely, no matter what happens, it's going to have a long-term impact. And you're going to see, I think, a lot more investment in domestic capability, even if all this is resolved in an amicable way or in the optimistic side of things.
So when you say USMCA, you're talking about the trade agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico to create a sort of a free trade zone.
Yes, yeah, and it was formerly NAFTA, updated under Trump administration 1, comes under review later this year. So it's something else to watch. That could be something we're talking about in a future podcast.
Okay, Michael, you want to have the final word?
I think that it's a well-known phrase in business. Business hates uncertainty, right? It's the worst thing. All they want to know are what are the rules, and then they can adjust their business models, adjust their contracts and their long-term agreements and their supply chains and whatever else. And we are not in a situation where demand remains, any kind of a question in this industry. Commercial air traffic passenger growth continues to climb. Defense budgets continue to climb. Those are great news. But what this does is continue to question and grow the question about whether this industry can supply in the end, whether it can meet the demand. And that is something that I think is going to be much, much more of a long-term issue for this industry than I think people were expecting even last year.
Okay, well, guys, thank you for an insightful conversation. I suspect you're right, Michael. I suspect the four of us will be back because this story for certain is not over. It's almost just a new chapter in a long-standing saga. Kevin, thank you for taking the time to join us. Jens, thank you as well for your time. That is a wrap for this week's Check 6. Also would like to thank our podcast editor in London, Guy Fernyhough. Be sure to follow Check 6 wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You can also watch some of our episodes, including this one, on our YouTube channel. Thanks for checking in with Check 6, and bye for now.